Assalamu alaikum and Eid al-Ghadir Mubarak to you all and to you, Hajj Kauthar. Thank you all so much for joining us on the second part of our series on anti-racism for the Muslim community, specifically geared towards our Shia community. My name is Hanna Chandu. I am your host this afternoon. I have lived in California for almost a decade now and am an attorney by profession. I serve on the governance board for CARE LA, the Council of American Islamic Relations Los Angeles chapter, and I also volunteer my time with the Shia Muslim Council and various masajid. Joining me today is Kauthar Khan. Hajj Kauthar has served as Yasin Educational Foundation's religious and educational advisor for 15 years. He has a master's degree in psychology and religious studies and is pursuing a doctoral degree in clinical psychology and theology. Hajj Kauthar works primarily with teenagers and young adults, has lectured throughout universities in Southern California, and has worked as a counselor in addiction treatment facilities, working with people who have suffered from addiction and trauma. Before we begin, I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsoring organizations. Yasin Educational Foundation, a center that was founded in Los Angeles in 1998 by a diverse group of young American Muslims to facilitate the Islamic educational needs of students who were attending college. Although it's traditionally known as a local youth center, Yasin has grown over the last 20 years and become a diverse, vibrant Islamic center that aims to empower individuals with the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are required to successfully navigate the spiritual challenges of life in the current world. Our second sponsoring organization is Shia Muslim Council of Southern California. SMC is a community platform. It facilitates the exchange of ideas and experiences to enhance and support religious, social, humanitarian, and educational development initiatives like today's webinar. SMC actively cooperates with like-minded organizations to advance unity among Muslims. Our third sponsoring organization is the Shia Racial Justice Coalition. SRJC intends to connect the larger Shia Muslim communities around topics of anti-racism, anti-Blackness, and racial justice. They understand the dire need for collaboration between a broad range of organizations, activists, and community centers, and aim to facilitate continuous action in local Shia communities, whether that's through dialogue, projects, or bringing in experts, scholars, and educators. Last but certainly not least is Muslim ARC, a pioneering human rights education organization that we have all become very familiar with this summer. The Muslim ARC cultivates solutions to advance racial equity, connect people to foster a multiracial network, and create spaces for learning and developing racial equity. So let's dive in, inshallah. During the first part of this series, we learned how to define racism and how to correctly use different terms appropriately that come up in this space. So discrimination, institutionalized racism, microaggressions. And we'll link to the first part of that series below for any of the viewers who missed it. In 2017, the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding surveyed the Muslim community and found that Muslims supported the movement for Black lives overwhelmingly more than any other faith group and the general public. And that support remains strong in 2020. But can we truly be allies in the movement for Black lives without first considering what role we play consciously and unconsciously in upholding the very systems and institutions that make up the world? Namely the institutions and systems that are built to be racist, anti-Black, and oppressive. So today, Hajj Kauthar and I would like to spend the hour unpacking some of those questions and sharing some stories in the community that sort of will help illustrate the principles and framework that we talk through. We will be taking questions throughout. There's a Q&A period at the end, but we may pause in between and take some questions. There's a Slido link which we can share in the chat, and we're taking live questions there. So Haji Kothar, I will kick it off to you. Oh, I think you're still muted. There you go.
There we go. So, assalamu alaikum. Sister Hannah, thank you so much for inviting me, to the organizations for inviting me to talk a little in this program. This has been a long-standing kind of issue, as you know, in our communities, and it's kind of one of those issues that's kind of swept under the rug for such a long period of time, and we either never got to talk about it or never held that it was an important enough time. But it's better that we're talking about it now than it never gets talked about. So I wanted to just go over some, basic frameworks that we can look at this at, because there's a lot of confusion as well in our community and what's happening in the larger society, and kind of processing that through an Islamic framework, and then talking about fragility and what does that really mean. And I'm going to share my screen in a second, and hopefully it'll be a little bit clearer. And then, as you said, I'd like to share some real life stories from the community, and these stories are not stories from my personal experience, but stories of people who have kind of come to me and experienced a lot of what we're talking about here today. Because sometimes some of these conversations seem very distant to us, or it seems like something that's just happening in the news, and we don't have to worry about it. And there may be an incident here or there in our communities, but we're all good. So I'm just going to share my screen here a second so you can see that. And so when we talk about, racism and prejudice and all of these different concepts, the place where we start from an Islamic framework is really this word that we call asabiya. And asabiya really comes from a word in Arabic that means just to wrap around something and to adhere to something really, really strongly and not let it go. And I'm mentioning this root word because it gives us context in the type of kind of psychological and spiritual thing that this is. This is kind of a condition that's talked about in ethics, in Islamic ethics. And it comes from that root word of a thing that really wraps around something and holds fervently to that thing. And so something that just generally wraps around like that, it's very hard to unwrap. And we're going to talk about that. So as you see up there, I just gave the definition, and asabiya and ta'assub has a general sense of favoring or defending really fervently some type of ideology or a group. It could be a profession. It could be really anything. And the second, the really important thing to understand about this in Islamic framework is that I've given a general working definition from the book 40 Hadith about what asabiya is, and it's this inner psychic or psychological quality that's manifested in patronizing a person's kindred, which you have some type of relationship with, or you have some type of affinity with. And what I thought was very interesting about the definition Islamically is that if you look at the end of that definition, it says that it's a moral vice that's an abominable trait or horrible trait that begets many more vices and deviations and things like that. And we don't look at it like that sometimes. We just look at it as kind of a behavior. We don't look at it as an inner psychological quality. And I think that it's really important as our community has these discussions about racism and has these discussions about what happens in our community, just taking a moment to step back and realizing that it's not just, well, there was one racist incident that happened in the masjid and we don't have to worry about it, but understanding just from a spiritual perspective that asabiya is something that everybody has and can have. And it is something that we have to start internally working on. So it's not something that we can just dismiss as, well, that person's racist and I'm not racist. But it's something that we all really need to work on, because we all have this tendency to spiritual tendency to align ourselves with the group, sometimes at the detriment of others. And the interesting thing about these qualities is we tend not to see them, right? I mean, we never look at our own faults, or we never look at ourselves. So that's kind of a working definition of it. Now I want to give a really a quick hadith on this, and talk about why it's important. And one of the reasons why I'm covering this is, a lot of times the feedback that I get in the community is this question of, well, this issue doesn't pertain to me. I mean, it doesn't pertain to me practically, and it doesn't pertain to me even religiously. So why are we talking about this issue? And I've heard that for I don't know how many years. I've been working with Yasin for 15 years. I've been working with the Muslim community for about 20 years or over 20 years. And I've heard this constantly over and over again. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, about, again, why people have a tendency to say that. But I put this hadith up there for people to see, and it's a tradition of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his family, which says that whoever possesses in his heart asabiya and any of its forms, even to the extent of a mustard seed, God will raise him on the day of resurrections as he would raise the Bedouins of Jahiliyyah. Now, it's really interesting about this hadith that it's talking about the Prophet, peace be upon him, chose to mention that even if that person has that tiniest bit of asabiya, that little bit of a mustard seed is going to lead a person in the afterlife to be raised as if they didn't believe in Islam. So it's why is it important from a spiritual perspective? It's really important. It's something that our communities, our masajid, have to speak about, and they have to talk about. And it's something that we just can't kind of dismiss, because it's not just a sin, but it's kind of this seed that breeds all these other sins. And the consequence of that is that we develop these traits of that kind of society of ignorance that had existed before Islam, when Islam wasn't there, of people fighting against each other, and eventually leading to violence, and eventually leading to all of these kind of much larger issues that we're told about in society. And you know, when I read this hadith, one of the interesting things is at first you read it and you have this sense of, really, well, gosh, it's not that bad. Why would I be raised on the day of judgment as someone from Jahiliyyah? But we really see this played out today. We see it in our society where racism and these hidden forms of racism, how they kind of just snowball in society and communities, and how it really tears up society. And we're seeing this kind of just displayed out in public sight, where it gets to a point where it's intolerable for people. So, moving on from there, I want to talk a little bit about this concept of fragility. So as you know, there's this term kind of floating around about fragility, and there's a lot of discussion about the book White Fragility, and how does this play into an Islamic context, and is everything she's saying Islamic? And I want to get it kind of away from that, because the basic concept of putting the book aside, the basic concept of what's talked about in fragility is something that we can realize based upon the definition that we just gave, that asabiya really exists in everybody's heart. And we see that it's kind of this spiritual disease the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt actually asked us to work on. So this definition of fragility I put up here is, it's really interesting. It's this, and again, there's books on this, but this basic definition, this working definition of, is this uncomfortable feeling that a person has at discussions of race, and that displays out in a number of ways. It can display out in anger, fear, guilt, arguing, keeping quiet, or just not wanting to have the discussion at all. And I recall a while back, about maybe 10 years ago, I had given a lecture at a masjid on racism. And at that time, I was kind of really blunt with people about possibly some of the racism that we see in our communities. And I was bringing up some of these examples about how, not just with Black people, but how we see this racism played out, or this asabiya played out with different ethnicities, whether it be Indian Pakistanis, whether it be Iranians, whether it be Arabs, whether it be Afghanis. And at that time, 10 years ago, it made people really, really uncomfortable. And there were a lot of comments that came back. One of the comments were kind of, well, why are we talking about this issue? Why is this issue important to us? There's a whole bunch of more important issues. And it was really interesting because you had a whole group of people there that who had experienced racism in the community, that had really come to me for years and told me just horrific stories. And I gave just one speech on racism, and I would say the dominant ethnicity at that particular masjid got really, really upset. And so something I just want to pause here for a moment to say that I learned a lot after giving that speech, because I really didn't understand, why is everybody getting upset? And what I've learned over the years is that this is an uncomfortable conversation to have. It really is. It makes us all feel just a little uncomfortable. And that's why we have to have it.
No, absolutely. And I think part of it is that the Muslim community is at the forefront of so many civil rights issues and movements in this country. And so to sit down and acknowledge that we carry some form of discrimination within us, I think might come from a place of shame, definitely from a place of discomfort. I'm reminded by something one of my favorite authors said. Her name is Ijeoma Oluo. She's a Nigerian American anti-racist activist. And if I'm getting the quote right, I think I remember her saying, the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including inside yourself. And that is the only way forward. And I think that's sort of what part of this discussion will be, acknowledging that it is time, we all have it within us, and it is time that we sort of look at that and not sit in that shame or ignore it or push it aside. And as a community, create a space where we feel comfortable talking about it and unpacking it.
Right. And I think that, what's really interesting about this whole discussion about fragility, and as you read about the concept also, one of the comments my wife had mentioned, she said, yeah, reading about this is just like reading about, we kind of have this in Islam already. You look at your sin, and nobody comes to the table, unless you're a ma'soom or something, nobody comes to the table saying, oh, I don't sin. We all just say, yeah, of course. It's a given, right? And if we kind of take this concept on with the same attitude, I think it's a much healthier attitude. And I just wanted to say something else too. Why it's important, as we talk about this, in just a Shia context, um, I I pulled this kind of snippet from the book 40 Hadith also because I thought it was really eloquent and beautiful the way the author had put it. And he said, um, in commenting on that hadith that I just gave, why is it important? He says that, you know, a person who becomes that, and I'm just going to kind of read this here. Such a person is a defender and lover of truth. He will become counted among champions of human sublimity, a rightful citizen of the ideal human society, and wholesome member of society whose presence exerts a reforming influence on the evils of the public. And if one's selfish and tribal instincts arouse him to defend and patronize the vices and wrongs of his kinsmen and associates, he is inflicted with the vice of asabiya. He is a corrupt member of society who corrupts it by confusing vice with virtue and stands with the Bedouins of Jahiliyyah, etc. So I found this really, really eloquent and really to the point because, you know, again, after I gave that speech, what was really fascinating to me was that going back to the shame that you're talking about, some of the feedback that I had heard in the community, because I'd asked, you know, how did it go? I'd asked certain people, they told me the comments that were made, and people, it elicited discussion, and people would bring up certain things that happened to them, certain how racism was expressed to them in certain countries or in the masjid. And you would have still religious people, actually, people who are good people who would actually say, well, you just don't understand that group, or you just don't understand the culture, or and they kind of you know, outwardly actually support that. And I think that that's the first, in our communities, if we want to speak kind of frankly, that's the first level that we have to get to. And we'll talk about implicit bias a little bit later, but I think this really explicit bias is something that we just really have to peel back, because there is a lot of explicit bias where we're making excuses for things that are not such great behavior, and that kind of holds us back just in large as a community of kind of building a better society.
Yeah, it's sort of what Brother Ibrahim mentioned during the first session, which is what are the ways in which we perform intidar in a true way? How do we wait for our imam? And what is, you know, and this is a huge part of that process. Sister Marguerite also told a story last time about how the companions reacted to Bilal and Rasulullah's role in sort of setting society straight. And our religious leader at the moment is in ghaiba. And so it's up to us as members of our own community, as leaders in our own community, to sort of take matters into our own hands and force the reflection that Rasulullah was able to facilitate, in his time. So I think that sort of ties in really well with waiting for the imam, which is another theme of sort of today's discussion.
Right, and you know what? One of the interesting things I get back when we talk about this fragility, going back to this, I get there's this tendency in our community to say, no, well, we shouldn't talk about race, or we shouldn't recognize this because Islam has said that we shouldn't have racism, so we shouldn't recognize race. And that's interesting. So, you know, if you look at the slide there, one of the interesting things is from a Quranic perspective, we really have that this is actually something that Quran is very kind of clear about, that race is kind of recognized. It's just recognized in this lens of Tawheed. It's not that Allah is saying, okay, there are no races and you just stay colorblind. This idea or notion that, okay, we just have to be colorblind and don't be racist and everything is going to turn out okay. I think it's quite the opposite. What we see from that Quranic paradigm is really that God's telling us, no, this is actually one of his signs, that you're going to see different people with different languages, different accents, and different colors. And for those people who have knowledge, they'll understand that this is something really beautiful. This is a sign of God in society. and I just want to, maybe we can just discuss this a little bit. But I found a really interesting hadith regarding not just color, but this this interesting concept of this kind of hierarchy of color almost, which is it really speaks to how nuanced and how acutely aware the prophet was of his society, um, about the levels of racism and that hierarchy there. And if you see that tradition there, um, where it says from the time of Adam until our time, we are like the teeth of a comb, and there's no greatness for an Arab over a non-Arab, and no greatness for a red-skinned person over a black-skinned person, except due to one's consciousness, taqwa. What I found very interesting about this is the prophet chose to mention, he didn't just mention black and white. What existed there was really this hierarchy of some level of privilege and some level in society where there was a difference between how people were treated who were a little bit lighter versus somebody who was less light.
And we've all experienced that. I'm more fair-skinned than the average Khoja, so Indian ancestors who were in East Africa, and have always been complimented on the fairness of my skin. So we can talk more about those stories later, but it's definitely true that if we've all experienced shadeism or colorism to some degree in our own lives. And for those of us who are struggling a little bit with the idea of racism and whether we're playing a role or harboring any racism, starting at a place of colorism should help sort of bridge the rest of that conversation and make it more salient.
So I want to talk a little bit about how do we have this conversation, going back to this, because as I said, that this is a really difficult conversation to have, and over the years I've kind of thought about this, and one of the interesting things I noted from the time I gave that speech is that the majority of people in that lecture were young people. They were between the ages of 18 and I would say 26. That was 75%, and the 25% were older people. And what was shocking to me is I always had this perception, as you grow up living in the Muslim community, you always have this perception, oh, it's the old uncle that's racist, it's the old auntie that's racist, it's just them, right? They have these ideas about race, but because I grew up here, it doesn't apply to me, and because I'm younger and I understand the culture and I have some experience with different ethnicities, I'm not like them. I don't have those types of things. But in that lecture, what I found out is that most of the comments, it was interesting because the older people were just like, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. They didn't even kind of comment, right? But a lot of the young people were the ones that were really angry at the conversation, and they felt the conversation to be irrelevant, and that was really shocking for me. So I think just understanding that in our communities that we're not exempt because of age or because of circumstance, because we've interacted a few times with another ethnicity, it doesn't mean that some of those implicit biases aren't there, and sometimes even some of those explicit acts of racism or what they would call microaggressions aren't there.
It's interesting that you mentioned that age group, because I'm trying to do the math in my head, but I think the folks in that age group, one of their first elections might have been Barack Obama's election. And I remember having a lot of very difficult conversations in my family and with friends and colleagues about how the election of a Black president doesn't mean we live in a post-racial world or a no racism world. And so I wonder if that's also something that I think the younger generation carries, is we've seen a Black man make it to the top. We must have moved on at this point.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
This is not also about an individual act or or something that, we may have done, because that's part of the responses we see in our community, that, oh, well, I didn't do that particular thing, so this doesn't pertain to me. The other things is that, it's not always obvious. That's the whole point here. Why are we having this conversation? Because asabiya is not obvious. It's not something, if it's not something that we can sometimes clearly see we're doing. It really does sometimes require somebody to kind of point it out to us. And if it never goes pointed out, we just kind of go on in that cycle. Um, the other thing is understanding kind of how there are systems of oppression. And again, we'll talk about this more later, but there are already systems there that we're coming into that are very oppressive. And this really has to do with how history has been laid out, and that's human history, and especially history in America. When we start to study the history in America, going back to the transatlantic slave trade, and going back to so many things that have happened in this country, then we start to see how a lot of those systems kind of formed, and how we're existing in those systems, and we may be actually non-aware participants in that's happening.
Right, and not just limiting our learning or understanding to sort of the time of slavery, where there was this like overtly oppressive and clearly discriminatory and racist world, but sort of following that through Reconstruction, through the Jim Crow era, and sort of the systems that were set up post the Jim Crow era that furthered the objectives of slavery, but were called something different, and had sort of the facial protection of the Civil Rights Act being sort of enacted at around the same time. And so I think understanding that history is more complicated than we learn it in 11th grade, I think, is also another component to better understanding the systems of oppression, how they work together and how they were set up.
Right, and it's the difficult part of this conversation then becomes, if there's a system there, and I'm in the system, well, am I kind of upholding the system to a certain extent? There's this thing built around me, but what am I doing to perpetuate some of those things that are already in this system? Everything from where we move, who we marry, who we choose to associate with. There's a whole bunch of there's some stories we'll go over later, but that conversation, I think, if we move from acknowledging that we all have levels of asabiya in us, and we can acknowledge that, then we can really move past that and move to a real conversation of, okay, well, if this is a human thing, it's not just an Arab thing or a Pakistani thing or an Iranian thing or a white thing, because we tend to think that, oh, I'm not part of the KKK, I'm not racist, because that's the quick go-to, right? Or I'm not them, I'm not Republican, therefore I'm not racist. Or I'm not this, I'm not, people have these kind of things. I'm not saying all Republicans are racist, by the way. That wasn't my implication there. But some people say those types of things, and just grouping people into certain categories of maybe something extreme, that doesn't necessarily mean there are not these things in our community. So I want to talk a little bit about implicit bias, which I know that Sister Marjorie had mentioned last time, and I think this really plays out a lot in our community. And implicit bias is really being influenced by certain things in our environment, and we don't know how we get influenced by them. And so there's a lot of psychological studies on this to show that this exists. And again, this is really a human thing that all human beings are prone to. And this is particular with race. And there's a whole bunch of I would call it assumptions that we have about ethnicities within the Muslim community, um, regarding just beauty. For instance, and this is something that is commonly known, that, you know, and it's in all the cultures that are primarily Muslim. It's in it's in African American culture. It's in Pakistani culture. It's in Iranian culture. It's in Arab culture. It's in all of these different cultures where the lighter you are, the better you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember being so shocked, but also not, when I saw a store that was dedicated just to skin whitening creams during my last trip back home to Tanzania. And like I mentioned earlier, my fairness I've always been privileged by that. And it's been it's not subtle. Um, right? It's very obvious. Your daughter's so pretty. Look how fair her skin is. Like, those are the sentences. So, yeah, I think that's true. I mean, Brother Ibrahim mentioned during the first session that his children are treated differently because one is more lighter skinned and one is a little bit darker. So I think that's definitely true.
Yeah, and what, it was interesting because in the communities, what I've and this has come up actually multiple times, and um there was an incident in one of the masajid that I went to, and somebody had complained to me, and um it this is one of the, I guess, since we're talking about language too, one of the things that had happened is, it was one lady who had said to another lady, asking her, where are you from? And she mentioned, I'm this particular ethnicity. And she said, oh, wow, you look really pretty for that ethnicity.
Oh my.
Right. And this was said in front of a group of people. Right. It wasn't even like in a private conversation. It was just said in a whole group of people. And when the story was told to me, it was interesting because they said, what happened is the lady corrected her. She said, you said something really offensive to me. But what was really fascinating is the person who said the comment didn't get it.
And she probably thought she was complimenting her.
Exactly.
She probably thought she said a wonderful thing.
Right. And that's what she said. She said, I complimented you. And she was just so confused that, I don't know if she apologized, but she was really confused as why that person would kind of get offended at that. And so there are a lot of these just assumptions about beauty and how people look, and how they're treated as well. I see it played out a lot in our communities, and so something I want to talk about here that's really important about the beauty thing, because where I've seen it in play out in a very practical way, the damage of it in a very practical way is amongst children.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, this lady was an older lady, and she was an adult, and obviously it's offensive, but when we look in our masajid and we look in our communities, I see it, and I see it's really interesting because we have it played out in when lighter kids are sometimes given more attention. Even to the extent of a parent, I've seen this, a parent will have a lighter child and a darker child, and people just pay more attention to the lighter child.
Yeah, talk about what that child will be unpacking and as they grow into a young adult, and what biases they will carry and further when they have children. So that's an excellent point.
Right.
I want to take a quick minute here to just remind folks that we have a Slido link up. I believe it's in the YouTube chat. So if you have any questions, please do pose them. Haj Kothar, one thing that struck me when you were telling the story about you're really pretty for your culture, people in your culture, is the importance of language, right? I have had a hard time unpacking my privilege and what it means and my role as a person in the systems of oppression. And sometimes I think one way that I've been able to sort of think more clearly about that is analyzing my own language, right? Because that sentence, the intention and the feeling, I think for the woman who said that sentence, her intention was a good one. But if she had sat down, one way to understand what the problem is with that sentence is to think about it later. And so thinking about my language and the sentences that I use and what Black pathology is, or what racist sort of narratives am I furthering by the language that I use, has been one helpful tool in my personal anti-racism journey, that I think maybe is one takeaway that we'll cover sort of at the end.
Yeah, so you know, and it's not, it's just you know, it, yes, it's about the so I would say that this kind of implicit bias plays out in a couple of ways. And when we talk about language, and when we talk about language specifically, when I say language, I'm referring to the words we speak, the intonations we have, and our physical expressions. And just to give you a couple of examples here, and again, you know, sometimes what we're trying to say here is that this is not about saying, oh, you did this, you're a horrible person. That's not what this is really about. This is really about a beautiful self-reflection on how we get better as a community, and realizing some of those things that we do. I remember going to dinner with a group of brothers, and there was an African American brother sitting there who was born Muslim. And this is, again, one of the assumptions we make, is that every African American is a convert.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, we'll talk about that later. But so we're sitting at dinner, and we're having a discussion about some religious subject, and one of the brothers at the table starts giving his opinion, and he immediately kind of looks to the African American brother, and he says, Imam Ali, our first Imam. Imam Ali was the son-in-law of the Prophet, and he just keeps talking like this, and the brother's being really polite, right? And he's like, yeah, and then, you know, throughout the night he just keeps doing it until the other brother gets kind of a smile on his face, and after the first time, the second time he does it, someone says to him, brother, he knows all this. He's Muslim. You don't have to talk like that. You know, this kind of assumption that, oh, I have to talk down, which is a lot of us make that assumption, right? It's not just him. A lot of times we have that assumption. We see somebody in the masjid, they're African American. Okay, oh, they must just be a convert. They must not know a lot. They must not be aware. There's an interesting statistic I pulled from Pew Research about just Black Muslims and their religiosity, and I've just found it interesting, so I put it up there, regarding performing salat. And I guess what they in their research, they found that amongst African Americans, more of them, 55% to 39% from amongst immigrant Muslims, actually pray, which I thought was really fascinating, showing there's some level or metric of religiosity that's more in the African American community than kind of the immigrant community.
It's also interesting that we carry that assumption with converts in general, because a convert found the religion, studied the religion, chose the religion, and the rest of us were born into it. And so sure, that means we've got conditioning in the religion from a very young age, but that's different than zeal, passion, and belief. And, you know, leaving one's community to choose a different path or a different faith is a huge step that requires immense courage and requires a very sound understanding of what you're choosing. So I think I've always found that interesting. And I know I harbored that myself And it took many years of living among converts in a very diverse community in Houston for me to question the way I was thinking about that group of people. So that's very, yeah.
And the other thing is, I came across this really interesting hadith. I wanted to talk about this. So we talked a little bit about language and the intonation. We mentioned. It's also the mannerisms, and I came across this very interesting hadith regarding the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it's this man is in the prayer line, and there's a poor person that comes and sits next to him, and it's funny because we hear this. I've heard this hadith since I was a young child, and we hear this hadith all our life. And so this man comes and he sits next to a man who's rich, and the man who's rich does this. Kind of moves over and he kind of frowns just slightly, and the Prophet knows him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He knows him, and he says to him, he says, why did you do that? Did you think that his poverty would go on you? And it's such a profound hadith, because the man didn't say anything. He didn't say, oh, I think you're bad, or I think you're whatever. He just moved. That's all he did. He didn't insult the man. He didn't. And so now, as we're talking about these things like implicit bias, some of the misconceptions that we have are that, well, I've never said anything racist, or I've never said anything bad to anybody. And sometimes it's not just about that, how we treat people just Islamically, even it's those things we do really unconsciously to other human beings, where they feel welcome or they don't feel welcome in our communities. And it was such a thing that, the man felt so grieved that, he apologized to the man, and he said, well, I'll give him all my wealth. And he had this kind of sense of remorse there. But so that's something that I think that is a thing not talked about. One of the things that when I speak to people and I ask them, I always ask people when I see religious people in the community or non-religious people, whoever they are, I ask them, why don't you come to the masjid? And is there anything, the masjid can do for you? One of the responses that I've heard many times is, I don't feel welcome. And so my question is always, well, why? And many times I'll get the response that, well, because I go there and nobody talks to me.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. One of the questions we got is exactly on this point. So I think, if you don't mind, maybe we can address that now while we're sort of talking about this. Is, can you elaborate a little bit on what leaders of masajid and scholars can do to break down issues like this?
So I think really this starts, the question's an excellent question, and I think it really starts from the top. I think from an institutional level, I think it starts from the top and the bottom. It starts from the top, meaning that it has to become an issue in our community, and that has to start from the minbar, in a very focused way, talking about concrete examples versus talking about just the abstract idea of racism is bad and Islam is beautiful because it's a non-racist religion, but talking about how can that play out in our communities? How can we do more? So scholars and speakers giving very specific examples. That's one. I think that at a bottom level, it starts really in the Sunday schools. I think that if it doesn't start in the Sunday schools, then what we do is we raise children with this idea that this concept of race, and sometimes the problem of race in the larger American society, doesn't exist. Which becomes a real problem, because when you have a child who in Sunday school doesn't learn about why race is important, and they live predominantly in a white community all of their lives, they really grow up, and then when they grow up and somebody gives a lecture on racism, their first response is, well, this is not an issue. And so I think changing our Sunday school curriculums so that this becomes actually a chapter on ethics, and it becomes an ongoing theme, and teaching children in doing the tarbiyah of children in a way where they experience certain things in the classroom. They see how race can be played out and how these things can be played out, because these children will go out into their communities, and as we said, if there's a system of racism around them, they're going to pick up those things. So it's good to deconstruct those things from a very young age, I would say. I would say again at the top, it's important for the lectures, it's important for the scholar, or it's important for the heads of the masjid to make it a point that when people do come to the masjid who are new, greet them, welcome them, notice them. I know it's really, really comfortable for us when we go to the masjid. We just want to be around sometimes not just our ethnicity, but our little clique and our group, and sit in a circle and talk about our lives. But the leaders of masajid have a responsibility. We all have that responsibility, but at least at that level, making a concerted effort to look at somebody who has come to the masjid for the first time or a few times, who's a different ethnicity, and really reach out to them, go to them, sit with them, talk to them, and make sure that they feel welcome or they need anything. This is really kind of what we see from the imams of Ahlul Bayt, how they, when people were visiting their town, they would do this, right? Go and ask them, hey, do you need anything? So I think that would be a good way to enact this in our communities.
A sort of related question that came up was, when we think about the SoCal Black Shia community, most people don't know anybody who sort of is in that community. So how do we get to know those people so that we can sort of better understand them?
Well, so I want to take a step back from that a little bit, from that question, and talk about just kind of that frame of reference. So one of the things that it's very important as just an ummah that we have to discuss is when, because I've been asked a similar question, not this exact question, many times, is, where is the Black Shia masjid? And that's kind of like asking, where's the Pakistani masjid, or where's the Iranian masjid? And kind of, we need to deconstruct that a little bit of that othering thing where we think that, and I know the questioner was not coming from this point of view, but I want to address it since this question came up. Kind of looking at this at us all as one ummah, and all of these masajid really belong to that ummah, really belong to each and every person, whatever race or ethnicity they are. One of the questions on another class that I had gave, when I spoke about race, somebody had asked me this question. They said, why don't the Black people come to our masjid? And I said, for the reason that we tend to ask questions. We tend to frame things like that and think about that it's our masjid. So I think that that's really important. But moving past that to the actual question, I think, if the question is, how do we expose ourselves to, the diversity, the beautiful diversity we have in our community? I don't think that that's too hard in Southern California, because we really have a mixture of different ethnicities. And I would say that almost every leader, even on this, who are sponsoring this event, every leader on this, who's head of these organizations, has contact with the various communities, whether they be African American, Black, Pakistani or Indian or Khoja, whatever they are, Iranian, Arab, they have access. So I would say that if you're in a community, reach out to the leader of your community and ask that question. And maybe as a responsible member, kind of ask the question about, why don't African Americans come to our masajid? I mean, sometimes we just think that people don't come because they just don't want to be there. But sometimes they don't come because they just don't feel welcome. So I think it would be good for, as individuals, we start even holding our leaders accountable.
Yeah, I think the person asking the question is also starting to think about all the right things, right? And so one thing that, this is just personal suggestion that I'd like to make, is some mosques have Black Shia Muslim members and patrons, and some mosques don't. And so one blessing about Southern California is we have so many Shia centers. There's so many to choose from. So I would also suggest maybe visiting a different masajid, and just visiting a few of them, just to sort of better understand who else is in the community that's not attending your mosque. And you will meet Black Shia Muslims along that journey, is my personal experience, where if not all, they don't, I haven't seen a Black Shia Muslim in every center, but I have seen them in Shia centers. So that's just one takeaway that I also have. There's a follow-up question on changes on Sunday school, changes to make in the Sunday school. Yasin and other masajid are involved with Al-Kisa and Salam online, but those sort of like head leading organizations don't have content on racism. So how can we as a community or as parents of a child change that?
So I would really say that, so when we talk about racism, when we talk about any type of issue like this, I would say that, first of all, accepting that we're all responsible for the change is really important. And then obviously, part of that responsibility is holding all our masajid accountable, and our leaders accountable. Part of the Sunday school curriculum, and I think that where the person is that from what I can hear in the question, is part of our curriculums. This has come up in the Yasin community, and I've gotten feedback from people who are Black in the community. They say, I can't find a book I can give my son or daughter that has any Black figures in it. Like, you can't sometimes even find a storybook for a young child, where they can see that they're, okay, what's the contribution of, what's the history of Black Shias? What's the contribution of them? What, who are the people that played these roles in history, and are they portrayed in these books? And I think that's, so part of this is really having an honest conversation with the people that produce this content. I think that right now is a good time, because there is a lot of focus on this. I think having a sit down, and not maybe just a side conversation, having a real sit down with some leaders in the community and people who are designing the curriculum, to say, hey, let's start incorporating some of these things, a more diverse community. And this goes for everything. This goes for, our Sunday school curriculum, in terms of subject matter, in terms of the pictures and the storybooks, in terms of the stories and some of the stories that we tell. It goes to the content we post online. Sometimes, just a simple thing as the content we post, the pictures we post, the videos we post are not very diverse. It really gives the impression that we have a one culture at that particular masjid. So those might be some of the things that might help in having those honest conversations. And if we've had them, I would say that we need to continue having them. we need to continue having them with those community leaders.
Haj Kothar, I don't know if you have a hard stop at 6 or if maybe we could run a couple of minutes over.
Sure, we can go over.
Okay, great. So one other point in response to what you just said is there's work that we can do as individuals with our community leaders. And like Haj Kothar said, there's also work that we can do directly with other organizations that are impacting our child's education. I think tangible things, you can write letters, you can pick up the phone and call. If you haven't ever raised an issue of racism before and want some help or guidance on how to tackle it, I think any of the 4 institutions that are sponsoring this event would be happy to help with that, or at least guide you to the right place. So these are your resources when you're thinking about next steps. One person I think asked another good follow-up question, which is most leaders of masajid are not interested in bringing other people to their masajid. The leaders of the masajid are very comfortable sort of in the space that they currently occupy. And according to this person, in his or her experience, there are only 2 other centers that welcome other people actively. So they're asking, how do we hold people accountable in that setting?
Well, I think that it's again, I want to take a step back from this. So I know that our first go-to is sometimes these institutions and holding them accountable, and these institutions have to be held accountable. I absolutely think that we need to have those conversations. I think that the first step in this process, because there is a process in addressing this, and it can be done simultaneously, but it's really important for people who can see these issues and who really want to make that effort to start to make that effort within their own masajid and within their own communities. And going back to your question about a person was asking, well, how does a person connect with Black Shias or in the community? I think that's the right question to ask. That was a great question because that first question is kind of putting responsibility on ourselves. And I would say that the first step is beginning to bring to go into those circles and then also bring people into our circles, right? Because it's a hard process, especially when someone has been hurt by an institution, or they don't feel welcome by an institution. It's hard for them to come back and say, okay, I'm going to try this again. I think that reaching out to other people from other ethnicities, and then also inviting them into our homes. I think that's the first thing, and making them part of that circle. Inviting them to the masjid as well. Sometimes we sponsor a majalis at a masjid, inviting, specifically reaching out to those groups of people because again, the masjid might have this bureaucracy, and we don't want to be here in 10 years saying, well, the masjid just didn't do it. Right? So I think that first step for all of us is taking that, our own accountability and our own responsibility, and actively working in this process to dismantle kind of that system. Because what you're really talking about is a system, again, whether it's outwardly or in a masjid, it's a system that's been in place, that's running, and it's perfectly comfortable doing what it's doing, and everyone's okay. And here you come and you're trying to say to the masjid leader or whoever it is, hey, can you invite other people? And for whatever reason that they don't want to do it, I think that to dismantle that system is just to really just invite that person to the masjid, go into their spaces, and bring them closer to our spaces that we're in.
That's beautiful. And a great takeaway, generally speaking, I think, is focusing, yes, keeping the pressure on leadership, but focusing a lot on our own self-reflection and what we can do in our own spaces. One other suggestion that's worked for some masajid is if the masjid leadership is not ready to have a big conversation about bringing in people who don't look like you or me or whoever, think about whether there are speakers that the masjid may be open to inviting, that Black Shia speakers. There are so many of them. So that might be another way to sort of start breaking down some barriers by changing the visual in the mosque. All right, I think those are all the questions that were clustered in that thread. I've got one more question for you, Haj Kothar, if I can impose
Sure,
upon you.
absolutely.
Thank you. So someone asked, what can we do from a matrimonial perspective to break down barriers? How do we remove the stigma related to marriage outside of one's race or ethnicity? I know it's a big question.
Yeah. Um, I want to say one last thing, sorry, about I had left and I forgot, and I'm just going to get to this question.
Sure.
To address the previous issue when we talked about education, there is one point that I think is really missed amongst Muslims, and that's that African American history and Muslim history are one history when we talk about this country of Muslim history. It's not a separate history. African Americans have been here since the inception. If many of them brought here as slaves, and I think that when we talk about we're American, not recognizing that we cannot talk about Muslim history unless we talk about African American history is really important. So I just wanted to say that that's something that we should really have in the back of our educational philosophy in Sunday schools or in the masajid, that we can't develop an identity of Muslim Americans without that component to it. It can't be separated. But onto your question, sorry, and if you can repeat that question one more time so I can.
Sure. I got a comment in the interim, so I'm going to say something about that
Okay.
first, just because it's in the prior thread. I think it's the same person who's asking the follow-up questions regarding masajid leaders and accountability. So they wanted to thank you for addressing accountability, but feels like a lot of centers are not democratic, and the takeaway is maybe they have to go somewhere else. So I think I'd like to invite that person to contact any of the 4 institutions, Shia Muslim Council, Yasin. We'd be happy to sort of talk. It seems like there might be more to unpack here, and maybe Haji Kothar, I don't know if I'm volunteering you as one of the people that might be able to engage in a more in-depth conversation about this. Is that
Sure.
okay? So if you're still listening, please connect with any of us and we can sort of pursue this more offline. Okay, the matrimonial question was, what can we do to break down barriers and remove the stigma associated with marrying outside of your race or ethnicity?
So I think that I think that there's something that can be done from the leaders of the masajid, and the leaders of the masajid, I think, in this ongoing conversation, mentioning how continuously speaking about how this issue of race was something that was actively talked about and worked on by the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. I think that this is the first critical step, and not talked about in abstract ways. And I don't have time here to talk about those stories, but they're really, really clear stories of just blatant racism, of times people went to the Prophet and literally said, I'm not marrying my daughter to that person because they're Black, or they're this, and the Prophet told them, you're wrong. You cannot refuse this person based on that. And we have historical examples of certain of our imams marrying people who were Black, and it's I think so that the tarbiyat starts from the culture starts shifting from there at the institutional level. At the other level, I think that this is slowly changing in our community, maybe not as fast as we want, but I think out of necessity now, some of these cultures are marrying into each other. But there's still, I know, a huge stigma with marrying other cultures. And I would say that one of the ways is to begin to open up this uncomfortable conversation more, because it isn't opened up. And that's the starting point. I mean, I'm talking about people in general, not just scholars or speakers. I'm talking about people in general opening up this conversation of why can't, what's wrong with marrying a person from another ethnicity? What's wrong with marrying somebody who's darker? Now, I'm saying this for a reason. I'm saying the solution I'm giving is not this really elaborate solution, but I'm saying this for a reason, because when that conversation really starts happening, a lot of this implicit bias and a lot of this racism that we have in our community just starts bubbling up, and we can address it. Okay. As just a quick example, and I'm sorry, I know we're running out of time here. I want to just give a quick example, but I've talked to members of our community, and this issue has happened in me trying to get people married. People will come to marry somebody, and I'll ask them for all of their requirements, and they'll give me all of their requirements, and I'll go through this rigorous process of talking to them 2 or 3 times, getting every detail that they could possibly want, and I'd find a perfect match for them, until they find out that the girl or the boy is darker than them. And then there's this slew of reasons why they can't marry that person, until when I press them, then they'll just say, well, my parents won't allow me to marry somebody darker, or to marry someone black. And I think that elephant in the room just we need to recognize it so we can discuss it, because we're in our community, unfortunately, we're not even at a point to admit that exists. We all know about it. We all know it in some of, but we just don't want to address the topic of, hey, this is there and it's wrong. And we need to call it out when it's wrong, collectively.
Absolutely.
So I think that's our starting point, really.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And it sort of goes back to what we've been talking about throughout this part of the series, which is it's time for a lot of self-reflection and thought about unpacking our privileges and starting some of those conversations in the spaces where we have some control or can, help steer the conversation in a different direction. Haj Kothar, we're out of time. I'm so glad you could stay over. Thank you so much for joining us today and for all of your contributions to the community. We are going to continue this webinar series after Muharram, inshallah. So please keep an eye out on the different mailing lists for SMC, Yasin, SRJC, and Muslim Arc. And we will have more information for you, inshallah, after Muharram. Thank you all very much again. Haj Kothar, thank you.
Thank you.
And Eid al-Ghadir Mubarak, and Assalamu alaikum to everyone.
Eid Mubarak. Assalamu alaikum.